of the Seclusion Working Group to order. We do have a
Recording in
quorum.
progress.
First thing on our agenda is to approve our previous meeting minutes. Hopefully everyone has had a chance to review the meeting minutes from our previous meeting. And if so, I would entertain a motion to approve those minutes. All right, we have a motion to approve the minutes. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed say no. The motion passes and the minutes are approved. Yes, no, no, all right. Okay, so we are going to start talking about proposed recommendations of where do we go from here. And we have, I believe, 1, 2, 3, 4 proposals that have been submitted so far. And we'll spend a little time discussing each of those in turn. So we will start with the recommendations submitted by Ms. Woodward, Mr. Haveman, and Ms. Hulse. You can spend about 10, 15 minutes talking through your recommendations and we'll discuss.
Yeah,
Okay.
Thank you, Senator Seeberger. We didn't coordinate our efforts here to say who was going to speak first. So in terms of
You'll just have to duke it out.
Yeah, we will. We will. We'll try to behave ourselves. So what we try to do in terms of our format here was set up our document that you have in front of you with the concerns that we've heard from fall now until winter from all members of the group, and also from some of our speakers that have come before us, and then suggest some language solutions as we're moving forward with some practical solutions for how we might be able to address those concerns. So I guess maybe we'll just go round robin a little bit.
Yeah.
I'll take on a couple of these and then we'll just go around our group here. So one of the concerns that we heard was the impact of past or potential trauma and contraindications. And we spoke early about this in some of the presentations that we had from, I think, especially from the group that came from Kate's district and my own when it came to contraindications. And so we definitely think that the IEP team should include a mental health professional or practitioner, school psychologist, school social worker, school counselor, licensed school nurse, other licensed mental health person serving in the district, somebody there to be able to speak to the contraindications and to speak to alternative restrictive programming procedures during an emergency before adding seclusion to a student's IEP or IFSP or behavior support plan. And so, sorry for all the acronyms there, but the BSP is the behavior support plan. Then moving on from there, making sure that we're addressing the parental consent issue. We recognize that parent consent is a tricky topic, especially when we are dealing with a lot of families and students who have English not as their first language. We think it's really important that eliminating passive consent during this time would be an important consideration for us to be able to take on. For those that don't know that, passive consent is for a student that's currently on an IEP. After 14 days, if we have not received a signature, then the IEP goes into effect. This recommendation would be eliminating that because we would want a signature from the parent to be able to agree to the procedures that we're moving forward with seclusion in the picture as part of that student's plan. We recognize that parents and caregivers might not
Sorry, this is Representative Sensormura. I apologize. I don't know if it's like this for other people on the call, but it's really quiet for me. I'm really having a hard time hearing. I'm seeing nods from other people. I'm not sure if the microphones are on.
I will try again. I just moved the microphone a little closer. Is that a little better?
Yes, a little better, but maybe just try to speak loudly.
All right.
I just want to make sure that we can, everyone online can actually participate.
It's not often I'm accused of being soft-spoken, so I will do my best. Thank you.
Use your teacher voice.
I will try to do my best. Okay. And then the last thing, and then I'll pass the baton, is disproportionality when it comes to the name concern. We recognize the disproportionality of the use is a concern for this group. I'm going to reiterate that I think disproportionality in our field is a problem when it comes to the overall use of anything when it comes to special ed, and the disproportionality affecting students of color. I will just speak for my district alone. I believe it's close to 60% of our district is students of color at Intermediate School District 916. So of course, we would have a disproportionate use of seclusion just from the jump when it comes to the students that we're serving. But But I think limiting seclusion to be permitted for students receiving setting 3 or setting 4 services only. This would be prohibiting the use for the vast majority of students across the state. We think it's only appropriate for us to be discussing seclusion when it pertains to setting 3 or setting 4 situations.
Sorry, I'm just gonna say again, it's just going in and out. So I do want to say, like, I really want to be present for this conversation. I want to be able to participate. If we can't figure this out, me and the other people online are not going to be able to, because it just keeps going in and out. We're hearing kind of half of what you're saying.
May I try? Is this clear? Representative Sencer-Mura? Okay.
Yes.
So let me just recap what Mr. Haveman was saying and make sure that you're caught up to speed. So the first recommendation that we made was to require the mental health team or the IEP team to include a mental health provider to address the concern that's been raised about the impact of past or potential trauma. So that would be an additional required member of the IEP team in the cases where seclusion is being considered or used. We also brought forward a recommendation that instead of allowing for passive consent, 14 days passive consent, which is allowed in pretty much every other special ed proposal following initial identification and initial provision of services, that we would require explicit written parental consent in the parent's native language for the use of seclusion. So we would eliminate that passive consent permissive permission. In addition, the recommendation that we're bringing forward to address the concern around disproportionality is an inappropriate use, particularly as it's come up getting used for disciplinary reasons that none of us are supportive of and things like that, is to limit seclusion to only setting 3 and setting 4 level services. So we would prohibit it outside of that level of special ed service, which we believe would significantly address the concern about overuse, inappropriate use, and start to address the concern with disproportionality. Just a quick check to make sure this is still coming through okay for you, virtual participants. Yeah? Okay.
Yes, it is.
Great. In terms of looking at effectiveness and efficacy, the recommendation would also require that seclusion data, including the frequency, the duration of any use of seclusion for those students, would be explicitly reviewed by the IEP team no less than annually, or whenever the parent or guardian or the district requests that that data be reviewed. And then I want to take a little bit of time on the next. So that's where we've kind of come to so far. And then I think one of the big concerns that has come forward is around monitoring and accountability for improper use. And when we were reading some of the research articles from the federal level and other places, one of the recommendations and problems that was being identified in that research was around lack of accountability and reporting inconsistencies, et cetera. And the recommendation that we're bringing forward here mirrors an existing practice that's used in the state for another special ed support, I would say, that is has limitations around it. So just bear with me while I give some context here, and then we'll talk about what this would look like for seclusion. So currently, students with cognitive disabilities have the opportunity to participate in an alternate state assessment called the Minnesota Test of Academic Skills, or the alternate MCA. As a state, we are limited to identifying no more than 1% of students in our student population to take that test. That's a federal requirement that no more than 1% of students are to be identified as taking that test. And then of course that requirement trickles from the state down to the districts. Historically, in the last several years, the state of Minnesota was cited for over-identification of students taking that test and was required to create a corrective action plan because of that. So the plan that the district developed was an annual report process where when districts identify more than 1% of those students, well, let me back up. All districts have to report on their use of MTES administration every year. So we have to provide certain responses back to MDE. They have data that they provide us that shows us our exact percentage. So I know in my districts, based off data that I receive from MDE, what percentage of students were identified of taking the alternate assessments in my district. If I under-identify, I need to explain it. If I over-identify, I have to explain it. And if I'm right within the window of what is deemed appropriate, I'm also invited to explain the processes I use in my district to maintain that appropriate identification. So the recommendation that we're bringing forward is to implement a procedure similar for seclusion, where the state could set an ideal threshold of the percent of students who are participating in seclusion or a rate use that they deem appropriate, and collect data. They're already collecting data on the use of seclusion. We have to report that quarterly. And then they would be working with districts to submit accountability reports, explanations, and rationale around any underreporting. So if they're reporting a setting for we're reporting 0 seclusion uses, they'd want to explore that. Is that an underreport, or are you really not using seclusion? If they're within the prescribed window, again, they can share the practices that are helping them maintain that low level of use. And if they're over, then there would be some additional questions or a reporting responsibility, and that would provide MDE a mechanism to target support to those sites that are overusing seclusion. And we bring this recommendation forward because we have an existing infrastructure that already works this way. We feel like it would be pretty straightforward to replicate that process. And we really do think it would help address some of those concerns, and many of them around monitoring and accountability. Sure, since I have the volume, I'll keep going. Another recommendation around improper use is mandatory annual staff training for all special ed staff and related providers. And we provide some information there in terms of related statutes and the topics that we would want to ensure annual training is occurring. Moving on, one of the concerns that's also been brought to the table is a lack of preventive and proactive interventions. So here we would be looking at implementing a continuum of crisis intervention support strategies such as CPI, and one that we've talked a lot about around this table, which is UKERU, and that would be paired with direct funding to help districts implement those evidence-based practices that would reduce the need for the use of seclusion in a really strategic and intentional way. In terms of disproportionate representation, we could also incorporate restraint and seclusion data into our disproportionality calculations that were used as part of our existing accountability system within the state. And then one of the questions that was posed to the work group was, well, what is a reasonable timeline for the end of seclusion? And we gave that question some serious thought. And our position is that setting a timeline for ending the use of seclusion is rather arbitrary. We believe the focus needs to be on building the systems and supports that diminish or eventually eliminate the need. This requires fair and sustainable funding, training, technical support, and resources to ensure equitable opportunities for improvement statewide, with emphasis on greater Minnesota, where a lack of resources and funding create some pretty unique barriers. Direct funding mechanisms should be utilized whenever possible, and that means compared to competitive grants. So for example, there's non-exclusionary discipline grants out right now. Those are competitive grants. Systems such as mine were denied access to those grants, and small systems are at a severe disadvantage to winning any competitive grant currently. And we really also just like wanted to put a plug in for leveraging other existing resources through regional service cooperatives and exploring some interagency partnerships to enhance that technical assistance. And we listed some of those reputable agencies in the parentheses on our document. And that concludes our recommendations.
All right, thank you. I'm wondering, would it work best to discuss these as we go? I think it would work best to maybe have a conversation as we go through these, rather than wait to the end. So is there any discussion, questions, input from members of the working group? Ms. Winship.
Can you tell me more? I'm unfamiliar with the, on the disproportionate representation, the disproportionality calculation and accountability system. I'm not familiar.
Ms. Woodward.
Yeah, I can speak to that. So every year, there's several indicators that the state needs to look at to determine if districts are disproportionate in their identification or discipline practices. So they are looking at the data, again, that we report on annually. We have a whole host of data that we compile and submit to the state through various means. So they'll pull that data on a regular basis and they run a statistical calculation on that data to then determine in any given system, is there a disproportionality concern? So for example, recently in my system, I have been notified of disproportionality on a number of different indicators. I've gotten notice that I had a disproportionate number of American Indian students in setting 3 and setting 4. I was notified one year of a disproportionate number of white students with disabilities being removed suspension. I had received notice of disproportionality for Black students across my system with in-school suspension. So those are just a few examples. And the way that it works is that the state of Minnesota sends out, they call it a year 1 letter, a year 2 letter, and a year 3 letter. If you get a year 1 letter, it's like, alert, alert, you got a problem, you should take a look at this. And there's no direct consequence to a year 1 letter, no action needed, it's information, but it positions me as a leader in the district to say, oh, why do I have so many American Indian students in my setting 3 and setting 4? What's going on there? And I can dig in and look at that. A year 2 letter is like, you're still showing up concerning in this area, and it shows you your year 1 and 2 data next to each other. Are you trending up? Are you trending down? What does that look like? And at that point, some districts make the decision, well, I'll get there. So still no required action in a year 2, but it's like you're getting really close to a year 3. If you receive a year 3 notification of disproportionality and you have not been able to resolve that issue to date, then you are required to set aside 15% of your federal special ed funds to proactively prevent that problem from recurring in the future. That's called CEIS, Coordinated Early Intervening Services. So in my system, for example, we got a year 2 letter. I did not want a year 3 letter. 15% of my federal funds is a lot of money. So I set aside a different portion. You can do voluntary CEIS, and you can pick your own amount of money in that scenario. And so we did that to address one of our issues, and we've seen really, really great results. So we have that mechanism built in, and I don't believe seclusion is currently part of that calculation and that structure, but it could be. Even if it's not a federal requirement, it could be at the state. We make decisions to exceed federal requirements or do different things all the time as long as we're not, going below that federal requirement. So does that help explain?
Thank you, yes. One more question. What are they currently, so I'm assuming suspensions, special ed rates, what are the other things that they're currently generally measuring?
They will look at certain disability rights in your district as well. So in my last district that I came from before coming to 916, we were over, sorry, thank you so much. Yeah, we were over-identified for Black African-American students with a label of developmental cognitive disabilities. It's very common for an overrepresentation to be Black African-American in the emotional behavioral disorder. We're trying to reduce those rates. Those are the most common forms of the disproportionality that we receive. And I think, as Nicole pointed out, it's a system that we already have in place here in Minnesota. So this would be just something we could add to a system. It's something that directors of special education are used to operating within. So it would not be a lot for us to add this to that picture as well.
Ms. Sandsmark.
Thank you, Chair. Looking at these recommendations, really appreciate the work and time put into them. Looking at the monitoring and accountability and what is proposed, kind of adding on to an already existing system, it looks like. Curious about, this, it looks like would still utilize schools to do a lot of the reporting themselves, and a lot of it would come down to schools reporting on behalf of their schools. And I'm curious if this would, or y'all be open to, or could this include also some third party being brought in as well to look at these mechanisms, to analyze if a district is routinely and significantly above a threshold. I see MDE would come in then, but what could be happening in between before that happens? Does that make sense? To come in before it's at the point of not meeting that threshold. I feel like there could be some lost information in between that point and getting a report multiple times. Yeah.
Can I just ask a follow-up? Sorry, thank you. Can I just ask a follow-up question? Can you be more specific about what you mean by a neutral, like a third party, and what that might look like and who that party is?
Ms. Sandsmark.
Thank you. I guess what I'm asking for is if there are alternative ways to, and this is, I'm truly just asking. I think we've had problems with having sometimes districts and schools reporting only on themselves. I'm wondering if there's a way that parents can be reporting in outside of the district, or if there is something that we set up through MDE that comes in. It's a curiosity to me because I don't want there to be an excessive use that keeps happening year to year and then coming in kind of after the fact. I'm just wondering what more of a preemptive approach would be. I guess that's really the core of my question.
Ms. Woodward.
Sure. Let me try to answer kind of the spirit behind the recommendation and then see what that might do to address your concern.
And it might be a clarification thing for me too.
Yeah. So I think, part of why we're suggesting this approach, and I literally just went through this with my own district with MTAS reporting, is one of my district's programs reported 0%, and it was very unexpected that system would purport 0% MTAS implementation. So that's also a concern. And so even if you're not overusing, but there's an under-reporting or no reporting, that would also flag attention. And so to then kind of get at the heart of the matter. And then part of our recommendation is also looking at technical assistance, and you can see that in the last, bullet around timeline, was there are a lot of agencies out there that could be useful, including, our regional service cooperatives. So for my system, we work with Resource Training and Solutions. And again, we're trying to look at some of the parallels we have out there. So if you fail to meet academic standards significantly, you're assigned support personnel from regional services cooperatives to come and support your district in improving outcomes. And we don't have something similar like that for seclusion, restrictive procedures, overuse of suspension, et cetera. And so by including this as an option, that really was what we were trying to get at, is technical assistance at voluntarily, or because you're underreporting or overreporting per that process. I think there's lots of opportunities to bring that in. And continuing to let parents know what their options are when they have concerns about the services, supports, interventions that their child is receiving, because there are avenues for them to bring that forward, report that out. So just continuing to think about how to really empower them around their rights and amplify their voices. But systematically, that was what the spirit was. Does that help address the question?
Ms. Hansmark?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that clarification. I think I have a better understanding. And I think what this shows me too, that we'll get to our recommendations later, but I think there is still room for a formal process for parents to have and families to have a little bit more input to share their experience as well. And if that's through a formal mechanism, I think that could be really interesting. But I really appreciate the clarification.
Any other discussion or questions on the current proposed solutions or recommendations? Representative Sensimura.
Thank you. So my question is about the disproportionality calculation and accountability system, which you just kind of went over further, and that was really helpful. I know that in this committee we have talked about, so I'm glad to see that, you know, trying to think about how restraint and seclusion data might go together. I think that that's helpful, because I know that that's something that we've had conversations about on this working group. Another thing that has come up is the use of you know, law enforcement to intervene, right? And I have heard, you know, that if we don't allow seclusion rooms, then there is the threat of having more law enforcement interaction with schools and students. Is there some way that, I don't believe there is, but I guess, correct me if I'm wrong, like, I don't believe there's any way right now where schools are currently collecting data on if they are calling law enforcement. And if there's not right now, which I don't believe there is, you know, would that be something that we would also want to collect data on, right? If we see, okay, a school is not using a seclusion room, but then they are calling the police weekly on a student, like that seems like a negative outcome that I would want to be able to understand, that I don't think we are currently collecting any information on.
Ms. Winship.
I don't know if it gets reported anywhere, but I was just looking at our Minneapolis Public Schools database, and we do collect as a response to behaviors. So there's the, you know, in-school suspension, out-of-school suspension, law enforcement involvement. So at least in Minneapolis, it's collected. I don't know if you all know if it gets reported somewhere.
Mr. Heaveman?
Yeah, I just quickly did a search for, like, we do DERS reporting every year for discipline incident reporting system. So that's suspensions, expulsions, dangerous weapons, and other incidents. And other incidents, we have law enforcement referrals, school-related arrests, incidents related to specific student actions like physical assaults and possession of controlled substances. So it does get included within our DERS reporting currently.
Representative Sensimura?
Yeah, so I guess maybe in this idea of like a disproportionality calculator, I'm wondering if there's somehow a way to put that in, you know, of like how many times are we calling law enforcement about a specific student as opposed to using other tools.
Ms. Hulse?
Representative Sensimura, I will just say from my experience, that is something some of our districts have chosen to do because we hold some of those fears about, you know, seclusion, excuse me, the alternatives to seclusion, right? So in my district, that is something that we've added to our incident reports because we want to keep an eye on that statistic for particular students, for particular races, disability areas, because that's a statistic that we just care to keep an eye on. And I do think it would be an interesting thing to explore doing, just because we as a state want to keep an eye on it. And I do think it is slightly different to proactively track those data rather than reactively reporting them as part of DERS. Making a call to 911 is very different than having police respond and actually take action. A proactive call to police, if police take no action and are simply there to perhaps secure the scene or be backups to school staff who would never actually end up tapping out and tapping officers in, is a very different scenario. And I still think is very valuable information for our school staff and for folks making decisions like these. So I'm a big fan of it. I'm speaking just as myself, not necessarily for the three of us. But I do think it's something that can easily be done when you are a district that has a robust data system. That being said, again, back to our recommendation to engage experts and third parties with expertise in data systems, such as some of the folks that we referred to in that last box. There are folks out there, whether it's district to district or some of these folks, those are the data people. And I think that's the technical assistance that we talk about. Those data can be so invaluable in informing your processes, your systems, and making you better.
So I think what I'm hearing is, and that's a great question, Representative Sensimura. What I'm hearing is that different districts do things differently, and some, as a part of their overall reporting, include all of this. But I do think it would be useful, I agree with you, Representative Sensimura, to try to break this out a little bit and suss out what is actually happening. And it sounds like perhaps there might be a framework or folks that can help put something like that in place. Did you have anything else, Representative Sensimura?
No.
Okay, Ms. Chose, I think you had a question or comment?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I'm looking at this IEP section and that second part, and I love that it's explicit and that, you know, parents need to agree and there's no passive implicit consent for that. I guess I'm trying to understand the spirit again of your recommendations in that I totally understand this, but the implications for other tools. So if we're going to be also, and your other recommendation is continuum of crisis intervention strategies, like, you know, Yukiro or others, will the parent also be made aware that there are alternatives at this time to other tools? And what happens if you're in a level 3, level 4 setting and I refuse to give my permission to use seclusion for my child who may
Ms.
have
Woodward.
behavioral problems?
Yep, thanks. Ms. Woodward.
Thank you, Chair Seeberger. That's a great question. And so a couple of items there. Starting with the latter, when a parent refuses to give consent to a particular service or support in an IEP, when they deny that consent, we can't proceed. And so we work through a variety of strategies to move toward agreement. And sometimes that we're not able to get there on particular aspects of a proposal. And when that happens, we either need to work within what they are agreeing to, or we need to pursue a due process hearing if the district feels that that is so essential to safety and it's so necessary for a FAPE. That would be our only mechanism, and that's not where we go as districts lightly or frequently, just to be clear. And so we really use that piece we really use that disagreement as an opportunity to come back around the table and figure out what we're going to be doing. Ms. Jones, could you repeat the first part of your question?
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So I, as I said before, I'm a parent of a child who had level 3 and level 4 settings. had use of seclusion, so I've got a wide, personal experience on this. And I felt, will not a parent feel that my options are limited? So
Got
while
it.
I might feel forced to have to agree to that. Is one
Appreciate
thing. But
that.
will you also, and will you also, because they might have to leave school or have other options, but that kind of goes to my second part. The first part was really about, will you also talk about
Alternatives.
the other alternatives?
Yes.
Like, because, I think that would be to give them the whole story there, because I would feel pressured to agree to seclusion as I did.
Yeah.
Because I was afraid of losing the setting that I worked so hard to get her into.
Thank you for reminding me of the first part of your question. That's an important one. As an IEP team, we are always obligated to consider other options. And so I think that's where the part of training comes so important, of how do we discuss these considerations at the IEP table? And if we were bringing forward a proposal like seclusion, what are the other options that we could consider? The parent has voice there too, to inquire about that, to present other options, but that really is our responsibility as an IEP team, is to discuss and consider other options. So we would absolutely want to be working with our teams in those, again, setting 3 and setting 4 only programs as part of our proposal, to talk about what does that look like, and how do you consider those other options. Sometimes the district has to, at the end of the day, propose what they believe is necessary for a free and appropriate public education, and allow the parent to exercise their rights once that proposal comes forward. But we do need to give good faith in considering other options, and we need to train our special ed teams to be able to have that conversation.
Thank you.
Ms. Heiser?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I had 2 quick questions. I'll give you both of them, and then you can decide how you want to order them. My first question is around the grades. So I note here that the use of seclusion in students in grades 1 through 6 must be explicitly agreed to. I just would love to hear the reasoning behind the grades 1 through 6. Why not, kindergarten? Why not 12th grade? I'm sure there was some thought put behind that, and so I'm just curious as to the rationale. And then my second question is around the settings, in settings 3 and settings 4, and eliminating seclusion outside of setting 3 and setting 4. It was our experience at MDLC, as we monitored, that seclusion and restrictive procedures in general, when used in a level 4 setting, seemed to be used by staff that was very highly trained and had more staff on the team that was trained in trauma responses and in mental health. And then as you went down throughout the settings, there was less training or less specialty. And so I also wonder if there would be an openness to just discussing level 4 settings instead of both level 3 and level 4. So those are my 2 questions: the grades, the grade span, and then the settings as well.
Mr. Haveman?
Sure. I'll take a stab at the second one, Ms. Heiser. Thank you. I'm concerned with going back to just level 4 for a couple different reasons. I think, number one, just practically speaking, on behalf of a lot of the intermediate districts that serve level 4 in the Twin Cities area, we already have a wait list for students coming in, and when it comes to like just our capacity alone, if we're not sharing some of the supports and ways that help build capacity across our member districts or our partner districts, I'm concerned that it's just going to create a bigger logjam of students that are not getting access to programming that they need for us to be able to do that programming. And I think you hit the nail on the head a little bit when you talked about like the difference between a generalist and a specialist. Even in a traditional district where I've spent most of my career, those level 1 and those level 2 teachers are more generalists, serving a lot of students greater numbers of students on their caseload across a variety of disability areas, and more that you're moving into level 3, you're moving more into a specialty area of your service area. And that includes not only the licensed staff, but the related services staff, the unlicensed staff that's in that room as well. And so we felt as though, like, while seclusion might still be really rarely used in level 3, and I would say it probably is rarely used, like in the majority of my career where I've spent time in a traditional district, we didn't have a single instance in my career where we've had to use seclusion for a student that's in a level 3 program in any of my districts. So like that just gives you some perspective with level 3. Anytime we had situations that would require the physical holding to the degree that we're talking about here or leading to seclusion, we were talking about a referral to the intermediate district. So I don't think it's common, but I don't think it has to be exclusively in the realm of level 4. I think of those districts that are in outstate Minnesota that don't have access to level 4 services too. They're trying to build capacity within their system right now. So technically, it would not be level 4 that they're talking about as they build a more restrictive program for the students that they're serving. I think it really handcuffs them when it comes to their ability to be able to be creative and create that continuum when we're talking outside the Twin Cities area.
Who wanted to tackle the first part of the question? The grades. Ms. Woodward.
I can. I appreciate Dave's comments about that. Speaking from experience, I just wanted to add a little bit of color. We have, again, I'm from Greater Minnesota, and we have had situations where we've had to create a program, basically create what would be a setting 4 level type program in a regular school building. And it becomes a technicality that's listed as a setting 3 because there just are no other options. And having this as an option could, in those cases, prevent students from home-based placements and even more restrictive placements, denying them of educational opportunities. So just wanted to, from my own experience, I've been in that situation. Regarding the grades 1 through 6, we know that repealing the current restrictions on seclusion are not popular among some members of the work group. So we were really trying to think through that and think through early childhood and maybe even into kindergarten. So like just open to showing that that range is flexible. And typically we're seeing, first grade as, it's not exclusive of kindergarten and setting 4s for sure, but we were trying to think through that. I think we capped it at grade 6, just recognizing some of the current limitations, but we would be open to expanding that to any use of seclusion, K-12 for sure. I think we were thinking about the current limitations.
And I'll also say some of this is very, very close to language I included in the bill last session. In some of these conversations, particularly the elimination of the passive consent for use of seclusion, providing the information in a parent's native language. I think my bill even went further, requiring oral language interpretation and advocacy for folks who may be non-native English speakers. So to take those considerations into account, given the concerns of feeling like you're being either coerced or pressured or you have no other option to signing onto the use of seclusion. In terms of the limiting it to setting 3 and setting 4, that was an idea I had, I think, in 2024. I think I flipped it around to say prohibiting it in setting 1 or setting 2 or general education. To allow for it to be used, for example, in a day program or something. And I can't remember the exact basis, but there were concerns that doing that might violate FAPE in some way. And I don't remember what those concerns were, but I know that the direction I received from staff was, you probably can't do that. So as far as I'm concerned, it's still on the table, but I remember in the back recesses of my brain, there was some problem with doing it that way. Ms. Stansmark, did you have, or I'm sorry, Ms. Heiser, was there anything further you wanted to add?
No, thank you.
Okay, Ms. Stansmark?
Yeah, Ms. Heiser mostly covered, actually, I was gonna ask about the grades in particular. And I also would be curious to, you said you'd be open to K through 12 for this, based on what you've provided. Was there any rationale of putting it as old as first grade through sixth, or was there a reason to exclude youngest learners in the rationale when you proposed these?
Ms. Woodward?
I really think we were just trying to demonstrate that we are willing to, think about those youngest learners, and kind of, I think some of us really think about kindergarten as still an early learning setting, first exposure for some kids to school. And so providing that opportunity for them to acclimate to a school setting, because some of them don't go to preschool, or participate in early childhood programming. And so that's kind of where we were coming from, was just that early learning lens versus, okay, there's been a year at minimum of an opportunity to acclimate to school, to receive interventions, to make progress. And if that level of aggressive behavior is still occurring at that first grade level, then perhaps that's more reasonable in terms of a recommendation from the work group.
Ms. Hansmark?
I appreciate that clarification. Thank you.
All right. In the interest of time, let's move on to the proposal submitted by Ms. Winship. I will turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Senator Seeberger. Mine will be pretty quick. I think a lot of mine are really similar to what we just heard, maybe just at a higher level kind of overview. And when I worked on this, I sat and I first just kind of typed out and thought about my thoughts, my ideas, where I wanted to go. And then I tried to organize them and got stuck. And so I took a couple days, took a break, went back to it, tried to organize everything again, and still struggled. So I plugged it into AI and said, these are all of my thoughts and my ideas and where I'm coming from, please organize it for me. So it broke down into four sections. So first is the staff training. So requiring that annual training. And I think specifically, just like the previous group talked about, I think it's really important that it's a training that includes the neurobiology of stress and trauma. I think we talk trauma informed a lot, and I think there's still a lot of staff that don't quite get it, and I think it needs to go deeper, and specifically when it's around, setting for students in restraint and seclusion, they need to understand. I think a lot of times staff responses can trigger the aggression, and there are things that if they understand better and can practice, I think would be really helpful. The second is regarding the alternatives. So requiring districts to choose one of the vetted evidence-based alternatives, some of them we've already discussed, that focus on the proactive behavioral support and early de-escalation. And so for those districts that do have seclusion, they'd have to also incorporate one of the other options. And then the third was around funding. Of course, there has to be funding. I think we all know and I don't know the specifics, but the reading mandate that came out, awesome, except there was no thought about the training of the staff and the substitutes for the staff to get training. And so I think the funding to cover the costs to implement these new alternatives, because again, it's not helpful for a district to be told, this is what we want, go do it. So we need that funding to back it up. And then the fourth section, of course, was just on that oversight and coming up with something better, because what we're currently doing isn't working. And so other ways to track and determine when it's not being used properly, and then creating one of the corrective action plans for the schools that are either misusing or have high rates of usage of seclusion. So yeah, very similar.
Thank you, Ms. Winship. Any questions or discussion from members of the working group? Ms. Sandsmark.
Ms. Winship, thank you for your recommendations. Looking at the professional standards and the requiring annual standardized and evidence-based training, and looking at different modules on neurobiology, stress, trauma, I'm curious for you, are there any, this is a little bit general, I'm curious, are there any that you would name as things that you found to be really good examples of that, places that you thought would be really good places for us to start?
So
Winship.
my experience in Intermediate District 287 was with CPI, which a lot of districts use. I wouldn't say they touch on that. It's a very, for me personally, I think it's something that you went through every year and had to take the little test without much thought behind what you were learning and applying it. And I wouldn't say there was much on the neurobiology of stress and trauma included in that. My understanding is that the training for UKERU does include some of that. So I know based on my conversations that that would be one that does incorporate that. In my guess is that, because no, I don't have examples of the others, but some of the articles talk about the 11 alternatives. My guess is that the majority of them are going to include that, because I think most of us that work in mental health and work with students with these challenging behaviors realize the importance of that.
Ms. Sandsmark.
Thank you, Chair Seeberger. Additionally, I have one more question about requiring vetted alternatives. We obviously been talking about UKERU a lot in this work group, and I think for really good reason. I'm curious, outside of maybe including UKERU, I guess we need to talk about the money part of that, but to require an alternative, a vetted alternative, I'm curious, and this is just it's for you, but also for the group. What are ways that we can make sure we have a really good vetted system? UKERU is great. There might be others. Is there a process that we would have to implement through the state? I'm just curious what that could look like.
Ms. Winship.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think there is, in a lot of the research that I've read, they do give specific examples, one of them being UKERU and other options. So I think, yeah, we look at what the research already shows, and then we would have to decide as a state or as a group or whatever, what those options would be.
Ms. Woodward.
I feel a bit of a broken record with this topic, but I do think it provides the most perfect parallel. We've talked about READ Act here around this table, and I just left a meeting this afternoon where the Minnesota Department of Education released their quote unquote, recommended or vetted, if you will, intervention programs for structured literacy. And there's a list posted on the MDE website, as well as kind of guidance for districts on how to utilize that list. MDE also released a required screener, one and only, that they approve for Tier 1 universal structured literacy curriculum. There are highly aligned curriculums, and they list those out, and they worked with Carrie at the U of M to get to those recommendations. So I do think that there's a mechanism for that, and I think that's where we're really looking for technical assistance in what this is, because from a district level, and this whole UKERU movement, that was like a grassroots movement across the state and with districts about, hey, we heard that this is great. Did you hear this is great? Hey, did you guys hear this is great? And we're all doing it from the ground up. And we aren't getting that technical assistance in this regard. And I'm not saying that to be critical. I'm just saying, READ Act, we're moving forward because a lot of time, energy, effort, resources, right, was put into that. And so I think there's opportunity here to align resources to something similar. So because as districts, we don't have capacity always to do that on our own, which is why I think we're seeing this kind of broad sweep of UKERU, because so many of us have used it with success. And the teachers and staff who are receiving that training are responding really positively, particularly to that piece around neurobiology. So that was just, I think, something to kind of share in alignment to your question.
Ms. Sandsmark. And I think that's a really good question, and I sort of had the same question. I mean, as a group, we devoted a couple of meetings to exploring alternatives to the use of seclusion, and I sort of came to the personal conclusion that there's just not a lot out there, UKERU being one thing. And remembering how things kind of unfolded coming to the point where the state actually stepped in when it comes to the READ Act and said, you are going to use this curriculum and you are going to teach these things. I bristled at that a little bit because as a licensed Tier 4 teacher myself, there's a lot of craft that goes into teaching, and I took a little bit of personal offense at thinking that the state's going to come in and tell me how to actually teach students. On the other hand, when it comes to emergency situations, I think everything's on the table. And I read through one of the submissions on sort of how UCARO came to be, and we really do need, I think there is kind of a lack of alternative options for emergency situations. I think a lot of time has been spent on things like PBIS and de-escalation and ways to help students regulate, but not a lot on what happens when that fails. So, forgot where I was going there. Anyway, I do love the option to somehow fund and direct districts to use vetted alternatives to seclusion. We got to figure out what those could possibly be. Any other questions or comments on Ms. Winship's recommendations? All right, seeing none, we will move on to the recommendations of Ms. Sandsmark and Ms. Heiser. I will turn the floor over to you.
Okay, hello. Jessica, I know you're virtual, so feel free to interrupt and pop in whenever. So we created a list of recommendations, both based off of conversations that were had here and based off of conversations we've had with other experts in this field looking at restrictive procedures and seclusion. And so this is, these recommendations are both, talk more broadly about ways to implement different strategies and different alternatives within the building themselves, also looking at the laws themselves. So the first couple of things, of course, me, as a part of SNS and Jessica Heiser as the Disability Law Center, we would like to see the continuation of the seclusion ban as is, pre-K through third, with the idea that there be long-term looks at banning seclusion long-term as a whole in the state of Minnesota. So first thing, eliminate the use of seclusion by 2026 per MD recommendations and figure out how to do that. There's not like a perfect way to do that, but that is top line per what was recommended in 2023. Continue the ban on pre-K through third grade seclusions as is. Continue the ban on pre-K through third grade seclusions with improved implementation policy and funding for schools to adjust course, like what was recommended by Winship, by really all the recommendations so far, having alternatives and really clear alternatives to the use of seclusion, and provide support for those alternatives either through funding, well, of course through funding, but what does that funding directly allocate? Is it individuals? Is it proper training? Is it looking at how teachers are trained in the first place to go through a tier 3, tier 4 licensure, in a setting 3 and setting 4 school with their license coming out of higher education? Eliminate the use of seclusion in a different time frame with more time to adopt and improve implementation practices. We're open to what that could look like. We definitely hold strong that we want to see a long-term ban on seclusion in the state of Minnesota, but what does that look like? What does that time frame look like? And then moving on to more nuanced and specific items here. Funding training on de-escalation, co-regulation, and understanding sensory processing needs for all staff, not just a single behavior intervention person per school. Everyone who receives an MDE training on how to use seclusion legally should also receive training on how to avoid using seclusion, and having that be a part of that training. Require school districts to publicly document the number of seclusions each year in a public-facing manner, so parents have visibility to high seclusion uses in schools. Ensure data includes disaggregation by race and disability. Mandate training on ableism for schools to increase understanding of what is perceived as a behavior versus what is part of somebody's disability. Broaden the scope for those who receive training in co-regulation and de-escalation strategies. Often there is only a single interventionist per school who has received this training. These strategies are invaluable to everyone, in the educational environment and should be offered to lunchroom staff, bus drivers, paras, library personnel, social workers, as well as students themselves. Everyone who comes in contact with students should be trained in conflict resolution and de-escalation strategies. Also, training educators on how to support demand avoidant students. Teach educators that demand avoidance is what demand avoidance is, how it presents, and how conventional strategies often have the opposite of the desired effect. Shift outmoded control and compliance-based strategies and focus on communication and connection instead. Teachers are often rewarded for their, and this is historically, I'm not saying that this happens all the time, but historically we have seen a use of rewarding for the ability to control a classroom and punish for the leniency when they prioritize connection over control. And I'm thinking this is generally broad in the school district, not primarily always in special education classrooms, but what is the narrative shift that we could change, and are punished for their leniency when they prioritize connection over control and communication over compliance. This is an outdated way of thinking that actually causes harm, especially to students with a trauma history. Open and honest dialogue about the harm that is done when schools become a place where trauma occurs. Even though it may be a painful process, we cannot solve the problems we are not willing to admit exist. We need to talk about what happens when school becomes a place where trauma occurs, how it has happened in the past, and what can be done to prevent it from happening in the future. Encourage educators to explore any strategy that will break the cycle of trauma. We have seen successful de-escalation through humor, through music, physical exercise, changing in the environment, and all of these strategies should be explored and ideally would be incorporated into any school day. Building bridges between educators and adults with disabilities. As parents and advocates, we have learned that adults with disabilities are often our greatest teachers and can help us gain insight into better understanding and supporting our kids. We are fortunate that in Minnesota, we have a rich community of adult advocates who are more than willing to share their experiences and expertise. When we passed the ableism bill in 2023, we had hoped that a discussion with adults with disabilities would become part of a teacher in training for every teacher supporting students with disabilities. That dream has not been realized, but there's an opportunity here. Consider an audit of outdated practices that escalate rather than de-escalate students with disabilities. Practices such as whole body listening or goals for eye contact often increase dysregulation. Practices such as sensory profiles, helping students identify regulation strategies, and allowing unlimited access to breaks increase the student's ability to regulate and decrease disruptive behavior. Teach children about their nervous system, and with that, and what is actually happening in their brains and bodies when they are in fight, flight, freeze, or fawn mode, helping kids understand what they are going through and helping adults understand what children need to feel safe cannot be overemphasized. Strategies like I feel this, I need this. This is all things that we understand here often in this work group, but making sure that that's a regular part of the training that we provide teachers and educators across our systems. And taught when a child is regulated and utilizing whole communication as proven as an effective strategy as long as adults, and we continue to honor it. We often see school districts reducing or eliminating related services in an effort to reduce costs. Speech therapy services and OT services are often the first on the list to be cut in times of difficult budgets, but communication and self-regulation skills are two of the best tools we have to reduce problem behavior. Engage with families in collaborative problem-solving behavior before behavior occurs, Open and honest conversations about what helps and what hurts can often help teams avoid difficult situations. Once a restricted procedure is used, families and educators often find themselves in an antagonistic position, which makes sense. Time invested in a collaborative relationship before that happens can provide a foundation on which to build during these times of stress and really creating an open dialogue. So that was a lot. sorry, but wanted to just list out a lot of different ways that we could move through and discuss better ways to look at restrictive procedures or how we talk about them with our students. So there you go.
Any questions or discussion on the recommendations from Ms. Sandmark and Ms. Heiser? Ms. Woodward.
Thank you. Just, absorbing and processing through the recommendations. And there's certainly some places where I see some alignment to some of what we've already talked about, particularly around funding for training and support to build that continuum. So I really appreciate that. I wanted to start with item number 5. And you talked about this too, Aaron, when we were sharing out our recommendations, an accessible mechanism for parents and families to report when they think seclusion is being misused, that doesn't require them to go through their school. And from our perspective and my experience, parents currently don't need to go through the school to report a misuse. They can go straight to the Minnesota Department of Ed to file a complaint if they feel like something's amiss. And I'm curious if you had, if that's just maybe not understanding that current process, or if there was something else specific you were thinking beyond that current mechanism.
Ms. Sandsmark.
That's a great question. And yes, you can go outside of the school district. I'm currently in process of working with some families on that process right now. I think really what this comes to is wanting it to be as accessible as possible and perhaps changing what that mechanism looks like. I think finding ways to figure out how to make a complaint or to file a grievance or to share that there has been a wrongdoing and to avoid perhaps a relationship that hasn't felt beneficial to the family. Obviously, the current mechanisms to go right to MDE and to different complaint processes, it is there. But I think, and maybe this is an MDE question, but making that more accessible and somehow weeding through some of those processes. I think right now, the way that system works, it is very complicated and convoluted. And I think a lot of us could speak to that. The websites are not very easy to utilize. So is there a way that we can make something very specific and streamline perhaps to have discussions on restrictive procedures and seclusion as a direct line instead of it being overarching into special education complaints? Maybe we specify it, maybe go through specificity in that, and that could help with resolutions. There's a lot of ideas there, but the core of it though is the accessibility of those mechanisms. Appreciate that.
Ms. Winship.
I will say along those lines, when I had my little guy that was suspended in kindergarten and I was trying to file that, the MDE report required that I sent the complaint directly to the district as well. So it was, which was not a big deal for me there. I had addressed the complaint a million times, which is why I went to MDE. But there is that requirement of sending it to the district. The other thing I wanted to mention is the importance of number 4, having the alternatives, which we've talked about, taking the tool away, you have to have the alternatives. I think with suspensions in the last, I've been a school counselor 15 years, but districts have been trying to, we know that suspension causes harm. It says that, research shows that. So they've been trying to reduce suspensions, but they don't have the alternative. So they're either secretly suspending, like encouraging the student and the family not to come to school tomorrow because then they don't have to report it as a suspension. Or their, restorative practices are awesome. They're not the perfect response to every single thing. And so if that's the only tool that a district has, it doesn't work out right. And so along those lines with this, we need to have time to build and have the other tools that are available.
Ms. Heiser.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to first, I apologize because I know you all are playing musical chairs in there, but Aaron, your mic is doing the same thing that Dave's mic was doing where it's coming in and out for those listeners online. So you may need to move to a different mic. The piece I wanted to add on the potential use of the MDE complaint that might be really nice for families is if it is an allegation of the use of seclusion, some additional indication on that complaint form, a box that they can check or something that says, this is a seclusion issue. We have heard, actually I just had a meeting this morning about this, that MDE typically has 60 days by law to process their complaints. They are so backed up. I mean, they are swamped. They're taking longer than 60 days consistently. And that is not I'm not trying to admonish MDE at all. I know they're swamped. I know our federal resources are no longer there for those complaints. But if we are talking about seclusion as used in an emergency, I wonder if there is a more accessible way for families to get those complaints either pushed to the front of the line or certainly within the 60 days investigated and come back. Because if we have a district that is using seclusion inappropriately, that's something that I think we all agree on. We want to get in front of immediately. We don't want to be waiting 3 months, 4 months as they continue to misuse it as MDE tries to process a complaint. So that might be another additional piece on number 5. Where we can just kind of have a red flag system in place to expedite those certain complaints.
Ms. Woodward.
Thank you, Chair Seeberger. I just wanted to comment to appreciate these, and that is really hard on families and districts when those complaint decisions take long. And that said, with complete grace for the department, you can only do so much within your capacity. I do want to mention, because Ms. Winship mentioned it as well, I do think that is a advantage of the requirement that the parent notifies the district at the same time as they notify MDE of a complaint, because in many cases in my position, I don't know that the issue is occurring until the complaint is filed, and it allows me to remedy the situation as I see fit based on my knowledge and training, even before they come back with a decision. And in a lot of cases we can, and not all cases for sure. But I do think that while it could be perceived as an additional complexity for the parent to have to do that simultaneous notification, it does position district leaders to help and intervene and help solve problems when we're able. So I just thought that was important to note.
I have a question for Ms. Heiser and Ms. Stansmark. And it's kind of been a question that's been plaguing me throughout this entire work group. As we have explored the issues relating to seclusion, as we've talked about where it's used, how it's misused, we heard stories presented early on from parents and other folks of terrible uses of seclusion. And I guess my question is, and I feel like we've been dancing around it a little bit, but what are you guys seeing? What are you guys hearing? You are in organizations that receive complaints and concerns from parents and families, and you're on this work group for a reason. I think Ms. Heiser talked about her organization receiving a dozen complaints a year or something like this, and maybe 8 of those are deemed actionable. I could have my numbers wrong, but I'm just wondering what are you seeing anecdotally that we're not maybe grasping here in the work group?
Jessica Heiser, let me know if you want to jump in at any point. Since you're not in the room, I can't make eyes at you to see who's talking first. But for us at SNS, from what I've directly experienced with families and young people talking to me directly about their experience, for us, it has been experiences of harm that have been brought to us. And I think for my organization and for the coalition I get to have the privilege of getting to speak for right now, we are just very worried about any expansion on the use of seclusion in any way outside of the current law right now, because we do not want to see any more children subjected to the use of seclusion. So the current ban and expanding that ban is really important to us. primarily because we have a lot of students that have reached out to us saying, I was locked in this room, I didn't know when I could leave, I was screaming, insert a lot of other things here, I harmed myself, I have a child that harmed themselves, they still can't look at me in the eye as a parent anymore because, or have a hard time wrestling with when I allowed a teacher to put them into a room repeatedly. And they are older now and still are dealing with the trauma of that situation and still do not understand why me as the parent allowed that. Over and over again, these types of narratives keeps coming forward, and I primarily work with Black and Brown teachers, families and young people, and I think the feeling over and over again seems to be that we have families that just feel lost in a system, and whatever we can do for us as an organization to put a stop to any usage has been really valuable and important to us because the misuse has been so horrible for the families and children that I've worked with that that's the through line for us. We're just doing whatever we can. I want to support educators. As a former educator myself, I want there to be systems in place for educators to have what they need. Of course, I know that. But it's hard to look a family in the eye and not say that what their experience is what was legal and that it was okay, or that there weren't any findings that we could legally say that the law wasn't followed. So my interest in looking at all these guidelines and all these recommendations, for me, through SNS and the folks I get to represent and have the privilege to represent, whatever we can do to continue to eliminate this use of what has been often used in a harmful way. And I say often, maybe we can dispute numbers, and we will, and we have, but in the cases that are coming into me, that it's been used in a harmful way for so many people that I've talked to directly, it's hard for me to see light in the usage of this practice, even though now having a really clear understanding of its usage in other districts and the reasons why it's used. So that clears up a little bit of where I'm at and where my coalition is at in its usage. And Jessica Heiser, I don't know if you had anything you want to say specifically to the Disability Law Center and your experience of intake of those cases.
But before we move on to Ms. Heiser, Ms. Stansberg, can you give me some idea? You say over and over and time again in all of these cases, how many are we talking about per year, whether they can be substantiated to be legally misused or not?
I think about 10 last year, and this year I haven't, or 10 in this year that I've received, unless I'm putting a call out for a specific case. I might not be receiving every single case, if that makes sense. I'll put a call out and asking for, do you have a story about the usage of seclusion or a restrictive procedure or a disciplinary action that you were confused by? So it's all voluntarily brought in. We have a hotline, but what comes into that hotline is really varied, and it can be about suspensions, it can be about seclusion. So it's not the same from year to year, but I'd say about 10 this year.
And is that more or less consistent with what you've been seeing over the years, maybe going back in the last, I don't know how long you've been with SNS, but going back over the last handful of years, COVID being sort of the weird blip, but is that consistent?
I'd say that's fairly consistent. However, I've been the executive director really only in this past year. I've been running our mainline programs since 2023. But the topic of seclusion hasn't really been a top line as far as what we've been getting calls about until the last couple years, and probably likely due to the uplifting of the issue due to the pre-K through third grade ban in 2023. So I'm more talking to a 2024 and 2025 subject. Yeah.
And I guess the substance of the concerns have they been determined? I thought I heard you said many times you can't find evidence that it was used contrary to the requirements of statute? Or how many times do you determine that seclusion was used for discipline, or it was used, I mean, we've heard stories of a child, locked in a room, you even said screaming, and to me, that can be, that's what my kid did when he was properly locked in, put in when seclusion was used. He was locked in a room. He was screaming a lot of threats and expletives to the staff who were, doing what they needed to do to keep everybody safe. So I guess my question is, having heard all of the conversation around behavioral outbursts and behavioral students who are aggressing, and who continue to aggress once they're in seclusion, in my view, that's one thing. And maybe a parent hears that after the fact, and it's upsetting to them. That's a valid concern, and they may come to you with that. But I guess I'm looking for a sense of the real, like the true horror stories of a student where seclusion is used for discipline, where it's used, I think we heard a story, someone was in seclusion like for 3 days, or, I mean, are you hearing those kinds of anecdotal stories that you can actually substantiate?
We provided earlier in this work group some anonymous stories of folks that shared their instances with us. SNS is not a legal agency. I am not looking over the stories that parents and families are giving to me as the barrier of what's legal and what's not, but I am there as an advocate to have them either bring this to next steps to MDE. Is it through the Department of Civil Rights? There's a few other avenues that we utilize, but I guess to what you're saying, I'm trying to think about the best way to respond. For me, and this is personally, and then I think for a lot of the folks, both on my board, steering committee, and community partners that we're able to work with really closely, to have families and young people, even if there was legal seclusion used, to have people reach out and be traumatized by its usage, even if it was legally done, to me shows that there's something wrong with the tool itself, even if it's legally used. So I think the idea that I'm not breaking it down with families that this one instance was okay and this one wasn't. I'm not breaking it down that way because that's not the purview of my organization. For what we do, we are an advocacy organization, and we are a coalition of people that are just really focused on hearing stories and sharing them. So any story that's being brought to me, I hear with open ears and am there to be, again, an advocate for families and parents. And the stories that we get brought in often, a lot of the people that I've worked with do not want us to go to MDE or to the Department of Human Rights, or do not want to go through a process like that. A lot of them have come to me years after the fact of something happening, or are fearful of not being anonymous. So I hesitate to give more specificity beyond what we've been able to share in testimony and through written consent in the letters shared, because any further information that I've been given, it's been folks sharing to me with the assumption that I wouldn't be sharing it outside of that meeting. Yeah.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Ms. Heiser.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think that what your question as it's posed may really reveal the paradigm disagreement at the crux of the issue. Because when you ask the question, you know, what horror stories is really happening? I haven't heard of anybody being locked in a room for 3 days or something to that effect. I believe that from MDLC's perspective, there have been many stories that have been put forward of parents and children who have felt like the seclusion that they were subjected to in a school building was a horror story, even if it lasted for 30 seconds, even if it was deemed an emergency under the law, that every single time a child is locked into a room in a school building where they are to feel safe and not be the source of trauma, that they do perceive it as a horror story and they do walk away with trauma. So there is a difference between the very heart of the matter here, where I believe what Erin is saying from her coalition and what I'm saying from my coalition is the ban is necessary because this is too dangerous of a tool every time it is used, even if it is used within the confines of the current law and it's not an actual legal problem, that it is still a tool that is too dangerous to be utilized in our public schools. But what I'm hearing from the other recommendations is, you know, there is a place for this in our schools, and it's nothing that we want to use, but in certain emergencies there is to be used. To try to come up with what is the threshold of how bad this can get before we say it's a problem, I think that's where we just have a fundamental disagreement. We think any use of seclusion is bad. There is no threshold that you can reach that will make it bad enough to take action. The data has already demonstrated it's traumatic to students. It's disproportionately used on students of color, on boys with certain disabilities, and therefore it can never be used safely, even though there are times in this state currently where it is used legally. That's the distinction there.
I think I'm understanding it much better. Thank you. Any other questions or discussion on Ms. Woodward?
Yeah, thank you, Chair Seeberger. I had a question about just kind of like what you're seeing, and I think just, Jessica, I think you named kind of that tension very well. So I want to get to a point there too, but I guess I'm curious, you know, Ms. Sandsmark, like when you're talking about these calls, like you said, like about 10, are there themes in the setting? Like, are these all over the board, setting 1, setting 2, gen ed, discipline, not like, or are they focused in on, you know, some particular settings? Because I think that's part of what we were trying to accomplish in hearing both you and Ms. Heiser last time around like banning something does in large prevent it from happening and could in large address several of these concerns. That's why we were trying to really narrow the scope to setting 3 and 4, because when you zoom out, the percentage of kids in our state that receive services in those settings is relatively smaller than the broad population. So my question is, are there themes you're seeing in your reports in terms of setting, location, et cetera?
Ms. Sandsmark?
So not in particular that there's one setting or over another. Often folks, when a family's dealt with seclusion specifically, it's been usually in a setting 3 or setting 4 situation. However, sometimes the family doesn't always know what setting their child was in officially, or it's been a few years. And I think they were sent to a setting 4, I'm not sure, but here's the experience my child had. Or it was, oh, I had this experience. It was in a setting 3, but also kind of a mixed special education classroom. There was a child that was put into a closet and things like that. Or I'm thinking of another example of a teenager talking to me who thought that they had maybe been secluded, but after going through the discussion, technically there was a ability for them to leave, and there had been another teacher in the room, and so that was in a general school setting. So we talked about it as maybe not a seclusion, but it was a restrictive procedure and disciplinary action. But there was a misunderstanding from that student, but there was still harm that was done. So some of the discussions I have with families are parsing through the definition sometimes on things. But I hope that colors that in a little bit. It's from all over the map.
Okay, Ms. Heiser?
I can just add to Ms. Woodward's question. I would say the lower in setting you get, the more seclusion, allegations of seclusion are more inappropriate. So for example, I think that's exactly why you wrote your recommendation the way you wrote your recommendation. But for example, just for those who are listening in, like if we at the MDLC get a complaint of seclusion being used in a level 4 setting where there are more highly trained staff versus if we get a complaint of seclusion being used in a level 1 setting where there are more generalists, those are two very different types of allegations, which I know you all understand very well. But also to Erin's point, a lot of times families do not even know what kind of setting they're in. So when you ask the preliminary question of what setting is your child in, they won't even know how to answer the question, and then we have to dig in deeper. But for sure, the lower the setting you go, the more dangerous the use of seclusion.
Ms. Winship?
I'm a big data research person, and all the research shows that seclusion harms children, whether it's done correctly or incorrectly. It shows that it's harmful. The tricky thing for me is we've got really competent educators here saying there's certain times where like we don't have anything else to do. And again, that's where I get stuck. Like I haven't found one piece of research that says, yes, this is the best thing to do in these situations. And again, educators are saying we don't have another option. So I don't know.
Representative Sensimura?
Yeah, thank you. And I apologize. I'm going to have to leave early. One kind of logistical thing, people still are going in and out. So I am wondering maybe if this is something that the LCC staff could try to work on before our next meet. Like, I don't know if it's possible to get a different room or something, but just it like a lot of people are going in and out, and I do think it makes it harder for the people online to participate. I had something I wanted to bring up, and I don't know if maybe this is a topic to talk about next time, but I would like to understand or discuss kind of as we move towards recommendations for the committee, what kind of procedures or threshold are we gonna have for making a recommendation. I know that checking in with some of the other working groups that are happening at the same time, I've seen working groups have procedures like, 80% of members need to be present to take a vote on a recommendation. I've also seen 80% of the people that are present, there needs to be an 80% majority for a recommendation to quote unquote pass. So Chair Seeberger, I don't know if you have kind of a framework that you are anticipating using or other members of the committee, but I would like to better understand that. Thank you.
I'll let Andrew George address part of that question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Representative Sensimura, can you hear me? Awesome, thank you. Yeah, thank you for the question. LCC working groups, commissions, task forces follow legislative procedure, Senate rules, House rules. So setting a quorum as a majority of the members and a majority vote to pass motions. If I'm understanding your question correctly, any different threshold to pass motions would require a rule or a bylaw, internal rule or bylaw that the working group would have to adopt on its own as a motion. So up to members' discussion and to you, Chair.
Representative Sensimura, does that help?
Yeah, so that's really helpful. Thank you. And so then just to clarify, if we did want to use a different process outside of just majority rule, which is what we typically use in committees, we would need to bring like a bylaw change, and that vote, sorry to get so complicated, but that vote would need majority to pass. So let's say I, for example, wanted to bring a proposal that says we need 80% agreement to pass this, to pass that kind of procedural thing, we would need a majority to agree with that. Is that correct?
Madam Chair, Representative Sensenbrenner, to get to a process like that, yes, that would make sense. A motion would need to happen to adopt some sort of internal rule or bylaw. Yeah.
Thank you. That's it, my question.
All right, we are going to move on. Before we do, I just want to comment briefly. A lot of these recommendations that we've been reviewing from Ms. Sandsmark and Ms. Heiser, I also agree with in terms of encouraging educators to explore any strategy that will break the cycle of trauma, talking about trauma when it occurs in school. I think it's important to also be able to have that discussion when trauma happens to staff because of interactions with students. Shifting outmoded control and compliance-based strategies, building bridges, all of these things are important. And when I went through my teacher training in 2012, I was old, I was second career, third, fourth, all of this was taught. And when I was in the classroom, all of this was a part of our mandatory PD, professional development. We can teach and train teachers, doesn't mean it happens in the classroom. I've seen plenty of teachers, coworkers that I worked with that I fundamentally disagreed with on principle on how they taught and treated their students. We still have teachers in the classroom who are rigid, who believe in control, who believe in I think really harmful teaching practices. Somehow they stay employed. And they have the same training that I do. They have the same PD that I do. And this has been a problem that has bothered me for a very long time. At my last job, I was a whistleblower and I called out teachers that did this. I lost my job because of that. They lost their jobs too. But I mean, it's a problem. And if anyone wants to hear my story and read the 100-page report that came out from an independent investigation that took a year to complete based on my allegations, happy to share it. It's difficult. I don't know, that's a whole other work group. What do we do with ineffective and harmful teachers? So I just want to endorse a lot of the recommendations that you include in your recommendations. I agree with 100%. How do we suss out the teachers that don't meet these standards and that do cause harm to our students? Is a question, I think, for another day. So let's move on to our final set of recommendations from NAMI, and Ms. Jost, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I think a lot of the discussion and can you hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
I'm hearing okay, great. I'm hearing an echo. Yeah, so I think a lot of my recommendations, or NAMI Minnesota's recommendations, have already been discussed, but I'm going to go through them. And as I sat and thought about this throughout these meetings, I really was starting to note where we align and really what is at the core of where the disagreement is, because we agree on a lot of things. We agree on seclusion is used disproportionately, the data and collection is troublesome, misuse of seclusion does happen, the impact of seclusion. Nobody likes to use seclusion. I don't think anybody in teacher wants to use seclusion. So there's just a number of things. So what is it? What is at the core? And it comes in for me where we keep, and I know somebody had mentioned, and I apologize for the name, but that we're stuck, that I feel like we're stuck. But is the question really whether there's a place for seclusion at all? Because some of us agree, some people say yes, some people say no. And when I think about this, I think it's really, is there a scenario, do we believe there's a scenario where with tools and culture shift, shifts the need for seclusion, or the need for seclusion is eliminated? Is there a scenario where if we implement new things, we could actually get to a place where seclusion wasn't needed? So not talking about banning or not banning, but a lot of what we're talking about is moving towards reducing or eliminating the need for seclusion. So NAMI National has the policy, written policy that supports the elimination of restraints and seclusion in schools, period. As NAMI Minnesota looks at that, you know, we recognize it's often traumatizing, ineffective, disproportionate use, all of those things that we've talked about. I coincidentally met with Ukiru and as well as Aspire Minnesota on a different topic. And that's why this report, this written testimony came in, because I heard their story. And what really struck me, whether we use that system in Minnesota or not, was that there is hope and it is possible to eliminate the need for seclusion. We can move in that direction. There are tools in place. They are proof of that. There's evidence-based tools that can eliminate the need. So one of the things that I thought was interesting with Yukiro and Grafton, their story is a couple things. One is, again, this hope, right? So whether we believe that there's a scenario where seclusion is no longer needed, right? We do, NAMI Minnesota does, but a couple of their best practices. One was they kept seclusion in place while they introduced their system. And so this, in really thinking about a best practice, really thinking about how we overlap the two with the goal of eliminating seclusion versus just banning it outright. We're not, you know, if you think about, we have to move towards a long-term solution. And so they talk about comfort versus control. So that doesn't really, I understand, you know, the issue about having some teachers who are really heavy in control. But so there were a number of things I think that we can pull from the story of Grafton and the use of and the build and the creation of that tool. Whether we use that tool or not, it seems like a great tool. And I know that we have, I believe they said 50 schools in Minnesota right now using it. The other thing that was really important there, they do learning debriefing, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So I have included some of that because it really made me think about this question about whether there is a scenario, and yes, there is. We believe there is a scenario where seclusion is no longer needed with the appropriate tools and investments. We don't believe that there should be a ban on seclusion outright without an overlapping process, tool, investment in alternatives that work. So really, one of my recommendations was that you should hear from Kim Sanders, CEO, and just hear the story. So she, because it was sort of late in the game, she sent in her written testimony. So I hope you all got to read that. And in the context of not selling their tool, but in the context for me that there is hope that the need for seclusion can be eliminated. And again, their best practice, best outcomes when seclusion remains an option while alternatives are implemented was really interesting to me. Also, there was a lot of resistance. The other thing that really struck me was that the things that they faced around fear, like what will happen if we don't have it, and safety, were all addressed time, and a pretty quick time. Some of these schools have implemented and seen continued improvement in less than a year. So I just, you know, for me, that again says that there is hope. Seclusion should remain available. I think as we're looking at this, we don't believe there's that just flipping a switch and outright banning is the answer in the long term. I know somebody else mentioned this, but including a prohibition on the use of law enforcement and school resource officers as a behavior or disability response by creating policies and practices that law enforcement can't be used for nonviolent behavior. I believe there's something in the law now around the use of law enforcement and but I think also if we're looking at trauma and we're looking at harm, we need to be prepared for the worst, yes, but we also need to have hope that that in the long term, we're not going to need seclusion. Any action should include solving for the issues of data collection. So as we go through this, we've all talked about it. I think you guys are in a better position to figure out what that looks like in terms of the educational system, parent involvement, all of those things. We're happy to give input, but ensuring and reporting and recording all the things that can happen, because I know there's a fear if we reduce seclusion, there's going to be an increase in other things, and we need to show that that's either happening or not and address it as we go along. There's the other thing that Ukiro did was shift the culture from this violation, repercussion regarding seclusion or restraint to one of a culture of de-escalation, collaboration, and learning debriefs versus this punitive. So while there should be a continued corrective action policy for the misuse, there should also be an approach that allows us to problem solve. So let's come in as do a learning debrief, and they actually, Ukiro does learning debriefs as part of their training, and they train the trainers so you can have somebody as part of that education, part of that system, come in and do a debrief and talk about what they can do different. And so that culture shift takes a bit of time as well. And I would hope that that culture shift also weans out, teachers who are too rigid. And I've had that situation with my child as well, with rigid teachers versus more open teachers. Special ed teachers are fabulous. All teachers are. I am not saying that against any teacher. So it includes investment, correct? Like oversight and data collection, whatever investment needs to happen there. Prevention and early intervention, like not forgetting that we should also continue to invest more school-linked mental health services, multi-tiered levels of support, counselors, therapists, those things hand in hand with everything else that we're doing. There's a need to continue to do that. I know that I've heard anecdotally through other groups that there are backlogs and wait lists, and so investing there. Investing in evidence-based supports or positive behavioral interventions, I think is absolutely critical. We have to have an alternative. Whether it's Ukiro or others, there are others out there, but also paying attention to the culture piece of that. Not just coming in and flipping a switch and say, here's some pads, but here's the system behind that. Here's how we shift culture, because it will be a change in culture. Designated and trained de-escalation. This is that point, like a mentor response team, whatever that looks like, that we come in and look at the things that are going wrong and offer support to those teams, those incidences, those teachers. Let's see. And I already talked about their the train models, something like that. You could have a regional, like a mobile response team that goes and supports schools. Ongoing training, ongoing staffing and statewide training standards. I think others have mentioned that as well. We need to invest in both of those things. I think that if we also, with the investment, look at prioritization of where we start, and that would very likely be the schools that have seclusion, even at the high end of that, of the schools that have violations of seclusion, and keep working, and so that all schools have it, not just the ones who have seclusion, but we want to give the appropriate level of support for all schools, whether that's training, whether that's tools, whatever level that turns out to be. And you have a better handle on the educators in the room than I do. I love the idea of, continuing and ensuring teachers and students are both educated and taught de-escalation skills, not just students. So that's the end of my recommendations for NAMI. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Ms. Chose. I'll open it up to the work group. Any questions or comments? Ms. Woodward.
Thank you, Ms. Jones, for the recommendations. And, I obviously really appreciate and resonate with the stance NAMI is taking that, they support the elimination of the need of seclusion, but recognizing that doing so without providing supports is short-sighted and ineffective. I also just wanted to name, because I just want to be really clear, when we first started exploring UKERU and heard that story, that's really what inspired us to look at UKERU, was that it really did drop their need for restrictive procedure and seclusion virtually to zero. And we want that. And I just want to be so clear, because I don't want the stance we're taking to lead anyone to believe that Minnesota administrators for special education are like, yes, let's use seclusion. Because when I hear that I have a program that dropped their rate of restrictive procedures, I'm celebrating. And we do not want to cause harm to anyone. And I think that's the paradigm that we're struggling with, is the rights and well-being of students and the rights of well-being of employees and other students, and how do those marry? And that's really the tension that we're navigating when these tools are removed. And so I just really appreciated that perspective. And I wanted to comment on, every group has mentioned funding. And I wanted to provide what I think is a really specific stream for us to look at between maybe this meeting and next meeting, and maybe this is something MDE can speak to and we could get some more information on. I was just in a meeting yesterday when we were asked about some priorities for our legislative platform for MACE, and we articulated that funding for mental health supports is one of those priorities for us. And we do have a direct aid distribution right now called Student Support Personnel Aid. And that money is locked into very specific uses currently in the current legislation. And the bulk of that has to be used toward any new additional position. If you can't hire a new position, or you're not using the money to maintain a position hired with COVID funds, you have to send it back. And last year, I just got the data, my system, St. Croix River Ed District, had to send back to MDE $75,000. And that money could have been used towards some of these ideas that we're talking about now. So I think looking to advocate for expanded uses of student support personnel aid would be a very specific recommendation. And I think in getting maybe some information from MDE about how much total across the state, that's just the St. Croix River Ed District, how much we had to send back because we didn't have new positions to fund. And some of our people we could have hired didn't fit the narrow requirements of who can be hired with that money. So I think there's opportunity there specifically, and I wanted to be able to use the time between meetings to maybe explore that further.
Great suggestion. I wrote it down. Any other questions or comments? Yes, Ms. Hulse.
Just food for thought. I will just reiterate, the largest cost to UKERU is getting it off the ground. Once it's up and running, it is a far smaller cost to keep it running. Initial training, expensive. Initial purchase of pads, expensive. But once you're there, you're flying, and it's kind of coasting after that.
I can't remember, what's the initial startup cost, ballpark, for UKERU?
Cost per trainer, roughly $850 plus add 200 to that because you end up paying the cost of the travel and lodging for the trainer from Grafton divided amongst the attendees at the training. And then cost per a bundle of pads, which you would buy per classroom, let's say, about $1,200. It's called a training set. Depending on, average setting 3 classroom, $1,200 per classroom. But they're sturdy, they're patchable. They do pretty well.
That helps, thank you. Ms. Winship.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm looking at the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint website, and they have the 11 alternatives to restraint and seclusion programs. A lot of them are like staff training and changing our view on behaviors. So that's something I'm going to look. I hadn't seen this before, so I'm going to kind of dig into that as some of the ideas. Ukira was, of course, on that list as well.
Thank you. Maybe you can bring some ideas back. All right, so we are almost at time. This was an excellent discussion. Thank you for everyone for your contributions today. I will make a last call for any recommendations before next week's meeting. If anybody intends to submit recommendations, did not get them in before today's meeting, please do so before our next meeting. At our next meeting, let's see. We are going to begin to refine and vet the ideas, try to boil it all down, maybe continue the discussion where we left off today if there's anything else that we need to talk about, or if you think about something, and start to refine things so that we can start to identify recommendations that will go into the report. What else? If any members of the public or stakeholders have any testimony they wish to submit on what we've been talking about or the proposed recommendations, they are invited to do that in writing, and the testimony can be sent to Andrew George at the LCC. And we have, when is our next meeting? December 17th is our next meeting, and we're going to start kind of culling things out and hopefully coming up with some recommendations that we can all get behind to include in the report. I know Mr. George has been diligently drafting his report, and you've done a good job. Yeah. All right. There being no further business before the work group, we are adjourned.